In the winter of 1879, when city inspectors finally gained access to the sealed records of Pittsburgh's St. Thomas Hospital, they discovered something that would haunt the medical community for decades. 67 patients had entered the hospital's divine healing ward over a span of 23 years. Not one had ever walked out alive. Every single death certificate bore the same peculiar notation called by God during sacred treatment, but the true horror wasn't in the deaths themselves. It was in the meticulous documentation found hidden beneath the ward's chapel floorboards. Pages upon pages of detailed observations, measurements, and what appeared to be experimental procedures, all signed by three names: Dr. Charles Anderson, Sister Helen Murphy, and Chaplain Robert Walsh. The city buried the findings immediately, and by spring, all three had vanished without a trace. Before we continue with the story of what really happened in that ward, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest secrets of American history. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, the ones that reveal the horrifying truth behind closed doors. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We want to know how far these dark American tales have traveled. The truth about St. Thomas Hospital's divine healing ward would challenge everything people believed about faith, medicine, and human decency in 19th century America. Pittsburgh in 1856 was a city of contradictions. The steel mills belched black smoke into the sky, while church bells rang out across neighborhoods where German immigrants, Irish Catholics, and Protestant Americans lived in an uneasy coexistence. The Industrial Revolution had brought prosperity to some, but for the growing population of factory workers, miners, and their families, life was often short and brutal. Disease ran rampant through the cramped tenements, and medical care was a luxury few could afford. It was in this environment that Dr. Charles Anderson saw an opportunity. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Anderson had returned to his native Pittsburgh with ambitious plans. Unlike other physicians who served either the wealthy elite or catered to the poor through charity, Anderson envisioned something revolutionary, a hospital that would combine the latest medical knowledge with the healing power of faith. He believed that divine intervention could work hand in hand with scientific medicine to achieve miraculous results. Anderson was a man of striking appearance, tall and lean, with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that lent him an air of distinguished authority. He spoke with the fervor of a preacher and the precision of a scientist. His vision attracted two key allies who would become his partners in what would later be called the most sophisticated medical deception in Pennsylvania's history. Sister Helen Murphy had arrived in Pittsburgh from County Cork in 1848, part of the wave of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine. Unlike many of her countrymen who found work in the mills, Murphy had secured a position at Mercy Hospital, where her natural compassion and quick intelligence had made her one of the most trusted nurses in the city. She was a woman of deep faith, but also of practical wisdom. She understood that suffering was a daily reality for Pittsburgh's working class, and she genuinely wanted to help alleviate it. Chaplain Robert Walsh represented the third pillar of Anderson's vision. A Methodist minister who had served congregations from Philadelphia to the Ohio frontier, Walsh had a reputation for powerful sermons and an almost hypnotic ability to comfort the dying. He was a man who truly believed in divine healing, having witnessed what he considered miraculous recoveries during his frontier ministry. Walsh was also a meticulous record keeper, a habit that would prove both essential to their work and ultimately their downfall. The three came together in the winter of 1855 when Anderson presented his proposal to the Pittsburgh Medical Society. St. Thomas Hospital would be different from any institution in America. It would have a standard medical wing for conventional treatments, but its centerpiece would be the Divine Healing Ward, a specialized unit where patients with terminal illnesses would receive blessed medical care, combining prayer, faith, and advanced medical techniques. The proposal was controversial. Orthodox physicians dismissed it as quackery, while many clergy worried about the mixing of sacred and secular healing. But Anderson had done his homework. He had studied the success of similar institutions in Europe, particularly in Germany, where some hospitals had begun experimenting with what they called holistic healing. He presented compelling statistics and testimonials from European colleagues who claimed remarkable success rates. More importantly, Anderson had secured financial backing from several prominent Pittsburgh families who had lost loved ones to diseases that conventional medicine couldn't cure. The Carnegies, who had lost a young daughter to consumption, were particularly generous. The Mellons, devastated by the loss of their eldest son to typhoid fever, saw Anderson's vision as a way to prevent other families from experiencing their grief. By spring of 1856, St. Nellen, Thomas Hospital had been built on a wooded hill overlooking the Allegheny River. The main building was constructed of local sandstone with large windows designed to let in healing light. The Divine Healing Ward occupied the entire third floor with its own chapel, dedicated nursing station, and what Anderson called observation rooms for the most critical cases. The hospital's opening was celebrated throughout the city. Anderson had carefully cultivated relationships with journalists, clergy, and civic leaders. The Pittsburgh Gazette ran a series of articles praising the innovative approach to healing. Local ministers, despite their initial skepticism, had been won over by Walsh's eloquent explanations of how prayer and medicine could work together in God's service. But from the very beginning, there were aspects of the Divine Healing Ward that remained hidden from public view. The observation rooms were accessible only to Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh. The ward's medical supplies were ordered separately from the main hospital, and the records were kept in a private filing system that no one else was allowed to examine. Most unusually, families of patients in the Divine Healing Ward were required to sign extensive legal documents that granted the hospital complete authority over treatment decisions and prohibited them from visiting during sacred healing periods. These restrictions were explained as necessary for maintaining the spiritual environment required for divine healing. Families were told that worldly concerns and emotional attachments could interfere with God's work. They were assured that their loved ones were receiving the most advanced care available, guided by both medical expertise and divine wisdom. The ward's first patient was Margaret O'Brien, a seamstress from the Irish district, who had been diagnosed with advanced consumption. She was 34 years old, the mother of 3 young children, and had been given less than a month to live by her previous doctor. Her husband Patrick, a steel worker, had spent his family's savings on medical bills, with no improvement in his wife's condition. When he heard about the Divine Healing Ward, he saw it as Margaret's only hope. Margaret was admitted on June 15, 1856, with great ceremony. Anderson examined her personally, while Walsh led the family in prayer, and Murphy assured them that Margaret would receive round-the-clock care. The family was told that the healing process would require complete spiritual focus, and that visits would be limited to prevent disruption of the divine work being done. What actually happened to Margaret O'Brien in those first days would not be discovered for over 2 decades, but according to the hidden records later found beneath the chapel floor, her treatment began immediately upon her admission, and it bore no resemblance to anything that could be called healing. The morning of June 22, 1856 began like any other in the Divine Healing Ward, with prayers at sunrise and the gentle sound of hymns echoing through the corridors. But by evening, something had changed forever in the third floor of St. Thomas Hospital. Margaret O'Brien, who had been admitted with consumption just 1 week earlier, was found dead in her bed during the morning rounds. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to advanced consumption occurred during divine healing prayer, but the circumstances surrounding her death would establish a pattern that would repeat 66 more times over the next 23 years. Sister Murphy discovered the body at 6:30 a.m. As she made her usual rounds with morning medications, Margaret lay peacefully in bed, her hands folded as if in prayer, her face bearing an expression of what Murphy would later describe to grieving families as divine serenity. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of pain or distress. It was, Murphy told Patrick O'Brien when he arrived that afternoon, exactly what one would expect from a soul called home to guard. But what Patrick O'Brien wasn't told was that Margaret had been moved to one of the observation rooms 3 days earlier. These rooms, located at the far end of the ward, were accessible only through a corridor that required a special key held by Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh. The rooms were soundproofed supposedly to provide absolute quiet for prayer and meditation. They contained not just beds, but also what Anderson called therapeutic apparatus, devices that he claimed could measure the spiritual energy of healing prayer. The hidden records would later reveal that Margaret's treatment in the observation room had been unlike anything practiced in conventional medicine. Detailed measurements of her pulse, temperature, and breathing patterns were taken every 2 hours. She was given experimental medications that Anderson had acquired through correspondence with European physicians. Most disturbing of all, the records contained precise observations of how her body responded to different substances, including several that were known to be toxic in large doses. The entry for June 21, 1856, written in Anderson's meticulous handwriting, read, "Subject MO showing expected respiratory depression following administration of preparation. Number 7, pulse weak, but regular. Notable absence of pain response. Recommend continued observation through night cycle RW to maintain vigil and document any changes." When Patrick O'Brien arrived the next afternoon, he found his wife laid out in the ward's main room. dressed in a clean white gown and surrounded by flowers. Anderson met him with solemn dignity, explaining that Margaret had passed peacefully in her sleep after a night of particularly intense prayer. Walsh stood beside him, offering scriptural comfort about the divine plan and the blessed nature of those called home during sacred healing. The family was told that Margaret's body had been prepared for burial according to the hospital's spiritual protocols. She had been bathed in blessed water and dressed in garments that had been prayed over by the hospital's clergy. This preparation, they were told, was part of the hospital's commitment to honoring the divine nature of the healing process, even when God chose to call a soul home rather than restore it to earthly health. What the family didn't know was that Margaret's body had been the subject of an extensive post-mortem examination in the hospital's basement. The records described in clinical detail the effects of the experimental medications on her organs, the progression of her disease, and the exact mechanism of her death. These findings were carefully documented and added to what Anderson called his research files. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Church, with Walsh delivering a moving eulogy about Margaret's faith and the mysterious ways of divine healing. The community mourned the loss of a young mother, but they also celebrated what they saw as the hospital's compassionate attempt to provide hope where conventional medicine had failed. Donations poured in from families who had been touched by the hospital's mission, and several other terminal patients requested admission to the Divine Healing Ward. But not everyone was convinced by the official story. Dr. James Mitchell, a Scottish physician who had been practicing in Pittsburgh for 15 years, had known Margaret O'Brien through his work at the Free Clinic in the Irish District. He'd examined her just 2 weeks before her admission to St. Thomas Hospital and had been surprised by her relatively stable condition. While her consumption was indeed advanced, Mitchell had expected her to live for several more months, possibly longer with proper care. Mitchell's concerns deepened when he attempted to review Margaret's medical records. Anderson politely but firmly refused to share the files, explaining that the records of the Divine Healing Ward were confidential due to their spiritual nature. The healing process, Anderson explained, involved not just medical observations, but also spiritual insights and prayer records that were sacred to the hospital's mission. The confrontation between Mitchell and Anderson took place in the hospital's main office on July 3, 1856. Mitchell, a man known for his directness, demanded to know what treatments Margaret had received and why her condition had deteriorated so rapidly. Anderson, maintaining his calm demeanor, explained that divine healing worked differently from conventional medicine. Sometimes, he said, God chose to call a soul home as part of a larger plan that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. She was my patient for over a year, Mitchell argued, his Scottish accent thick with emotion. I know her condition, and I know what consumption looks like in its final stages. Something about this death doesn't align with the natural progression of her disease. Anderson's response was measured but firm. Dr. Patrusov, Mitchell, I understand your concern, but you must remember that we are dealing with forces beyond conventional medical understanding. The Divine Healing Ward operates according to principles that combine medical science with spiritual intervention. The results cannot always be explained by purely secular medicine. Sister Murphy, who had been present for the conversation, added her own observations. I was with Margaret in her final hours, she said softly. She was at peace, doctor. She spoke of visions of her mother calling her home. It was beautiful in its way. Sometimes the most merciful healing is the one that ends suffering by bringing a soul to eternal rest. Mitchell left the hospital that day with more questions than answers. He spoke privately with several other physicians in the city, but none were willing to challenge Anderson's methods publicly. The Divine Healing Ward was popular with the community, and Anderson's reputation as an innovative physician was well established. More importantly, the hospital was providing a service that no other institution offered. Hope for families facing terminal illness. The second death occurred just 6 weeks later. Thomas Brennan, a coal miner who had been admitted with what appeared to be advanced lung disease, was found dead in his bed after 12 days in the Divine Healing Ward. Like Margaret O'Brien, he had spent his final days in one of the observation rooms receiving what Anderson called intensive spiritual therapy. The pattern was becoming established, though no one outside the inner circle recognized it yet. Patients would be admitted to the Divine Healing Ward with great hope and ceremony. They would receive initial treatment in the main ward with their families allowed brief visits. Then, as their condition allegedly worsened, they would be moved to the observation rooms for more intensive care. Within days, they would be found dead, always peacefully, always with the same expression of divine serenity. The hidden records showed a different story. Each patient had been subjected to experimental treatments, their responses carefully documented, their bodies examined after death. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were building a comprehensive database of human responses to various substances and procedures, all under the guise of divine healing. By the end of 1856, 5 patients had died in the divine healing ward. The hospital's public reputation remained sterling, but a small group of physicians and clergy in Pittsburgh were beginning to whisper questions about the ward's unusually high mortality rate. These questions would grow louder in the years to come, that they would never be loud enough to penetrate the wall of respectability that Anderson had built around his operation. The years following those first deaths brought subtle changes to St. Thomas Hospital that only the most observant visitors might have noticed. The divine healing ward's procedures became more refined, its privacy more absolute, and its reputation among Pittsburgh's desperate families more revered. By 1858, there was a waiting list for admission to the ward, with families traveling from as far as Ohio and West Virginia seeking the specialized care that only Dr. Jertling, Anderson, and his team could provide. The hospital's success had attracted attention from medical journals in Philadelphia and New York. Anderson published several papers on what he called integrative spiritual medicine, describing remarkable improvements in patient comfort and spiritual well-being, though he was notably vague about actual cure rates. His writing was eloquent and persuasive, filled with references to European medical advances and philosophical discussions about the connection between soul and body in the healing process. Sister Murphy had become something of a celebrity in Pittsburgh's Catholic community. Her reputation for compassionate care and her ability to comfort grieving families had made her a sought-after speaker at church gatherings and charitable events. She spoke movingly about the privilege of serving those in their final moments, about the beauty of witnessing souls prepared for their journey to eternal rest. Her speeches were filled with genuine emotion, and her listeners left convinced that St. Thomas Hospital's Divine Healing Ward was a place of mercy and grace. Chaplain Walsh, meanwhile, had developed a following among Pittsburgh's Protestant clergy. His sermons about divine healing drew large crowds, and his theological writings about the relationship between faith and medicine were circulated among ministers throughout western Pennsylvania. He had become an authority on what he called sacred medicine, arguing that God worked through both prayer and medical knowledge to accomplish his healing will. But behind this public success, the true work of the Divine Healing Ward was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The observation rooms had been equipped with more advanced measuring devices, some of them Anderson's own inventions. The hidden records showed that the 3 conspirators had developed a systematic approach to their experiments, carefully selecting patients whose conditions would provide the most valuable data. The selection process was subtle but deliberate. Patients were chosen not just for their terminal diagnosis, but for their social circumstances. Priority was given to those whose families were poor, uneducated, or isolated, people who were unlikely to ask difficult questions or demand detailed explanations. Immigrants, particularly those with limited English, were especially targeted. The hospital's charity work in the Irish and German districts provided a steady stream of potential subjects. Mary Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who spoke little English, was admitted in March 1858 with what appeared to be stomach cancer. Her husband Jan worked in the steel mills and had been injured in an industrial accident that left him partially disabled. The family had no money for medical care, and Mary's condition was deteriorating rapidly. When a social worker from the hospital visited their cramped apartment and offered free treatment in the Divine Healing Ward, Jan saw it as an answer to his prayers. Mary's case was typical of the ward's later operations. She was admitted with great ceremony. Her treatment explained through a translator who was actually one of the hospital's staff members. The family was told that Mary's condition required absolute rest and spiritual focus, and that visits would be limited to prevent disruption of the healing process. Jan was allowed to see his wife twice during her 2-week stay, both times in the main ward area with staff members present. The hidden records for Mary's case were more detailed than those for earlier patients. Anderson had developed a systematic approach to testing experimental medications, carefully documenting dosages, timing, and physical responses. Mary was given a series of substances that Anderson had acquired through correspondence with European physicians and chemical suppliers. Some of these were legitimate experimental medications. Others were compounds that Anderson had synthesized himself in a small laboratory he had established in the hospital's basement. Mary's death was recorded as abdominal complications during prayer therapy, but the hidden records told a different story. She'd been subjected to increasingly aggressive treatments as her condition worsened, with Anderson apparently using her deteriorating health as an opportunity to test the limits of human endurance. The final entry in her file, written in Anderson's careful handwriting, noted, Subject MK provided excellent data on gastric absorption rates. Recommends similar protocols for future subjects with comparable presentations. The psychological toll of this work was beginning to show in different ways among the three conspirators. Anderson had become more detached and clinical in his approach, treating each patient as a research subject rather than a human being. His private journals, later discovered, along with the medical records, revealed a man increasingly obsessed with the scientific value of his work and convinced that the knowledge he was gaining justified the means used to acquire it. Sister Murphy, however, was showing signs of internal conflict. Her public persona remained compassionate and caring, but those who knew her well noticed changes in her behavior. She had become more withdrawn, spending long hours in private prayer, and her formerly warm demeanor had acquired an edge of brittle intensity. The hidden records showed that she was taking increasingly detailed notes about patients' emotional states and their responses to what she called spiritual comfort techniques. Walsh was perhaps the most disturbing of the three in his adaptation to their work. His faith appeared to have evolved into something darker and more complex. His private writings found among the papers beneath the chapel floor revealed a man who had convinced himself that their work was actually a form of divine service. He had developed elaborate theological justifications for using dying patients as experimental subjects, arguing that their suffering was serving a higher purpose that would ultimately benefit humanity. By 1860, 12 patients had died in the Divine Healing Ward. The hospital's public reputation remained excellent, but a small network of physicians and clergy in Pittsburgh were privately expressing concerns about the ward's practices. Dr. Mitchell, who had questioned Margaret O'Brien's death, had continued to raise questions about the ward's methods, though he had been careful to avoid direct accusations. The concerns reached a crescendo in late 1860 when Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German physician who had recently arrived in Pittsburgh, attempted to visit a patient in the Divine Healing Ward. Zimmermann had been treating Klaus Bieber, a German blacksmith, for what appeared to be kidney disease. When Bieber's family decided to admit him to the Divine Healing Ward, Zimmermann requested permission to continue monitoring his patient's condition. Anderson's refusal to allow Zimmermann access to Bieber led to a heated confrontation in the hospital's main lobby. Zimmermann, speaking in heavily accented English, demanded to know why a fellow physician was being denied the opportunity to observe his patient's care. Anderson, maintaining his diplomatic composure, explained that the Divine Healing Ward operated according to specialized protocols that required absolute privacy and spiritual focus. "This is not medical practice," Zimmermann declared, his voice carrying throughout the lobby. "This is hiding behind religion to avoid scrutiny. I have been physician for 20 years, and I have never seen such secrecy in place of healing." The confrontation might have led to a formal investigation, but external events intervened. The Civil War erupted in 1861, and Pittsburgh's medical community was consumed with treating wounded soldiers and dealing with the massive disruption to civilian life. Dr. Kite, Zimmermann enlisted as a military surgeon and left the city, taking his concerns about the Divine Healing Ward with him. The war years provided perfect cover for the ward's operations. The hospital's main floors were converted to treat wounded soldiers, and the Divine Healing Ward was presented as a specialized facility for civilians with conditions that couldn't be treated in the military wards. The chaos of wartime made it easy to maintain the secrecy that Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh required for their work. But the war also brought new opportunities. Wounded soldiers who were expected to die from their injuries were sometimes quietly transferred to the Divine Healing Ward for what was described as spiritual comfort in their final hours. The hidden records showed that these soldiers became subjects for experiments related to trauma, blood loss, and the effects of various pain medications. The most chilling aspect of the war years was the expansion of the operation. Anderson had begun corresponding with physicians in other cities, sharing his research findings and offering to provide detailed protocols for similar programs. The hidden records contained letters from doctors in Baltimore, Richmond, and even New York, expressing interest in Anderson's methods and requesting information about establishing their own spiritual healing programs. By 1865, when the war ended, 28 patients had died in the Divine Healing Ward. The hospital's reputation had never been higher, and Anderson had become recognized as one of the foremost authorities on spiritual medicine in America. But the foundation of their operation was beginning to show cracks that would eventually lead to their downfall. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Father Patrick Alley, the priest who had conducted funeral services for many of the ward's patients, began to notice disturbing patterns in the bodies he was preparing for burial. Too many of the deceased showed signs of what appeared to be medical procedures that were consistent with the spiritual healing they had supposedly received. Allie's concerns were shared with Bishop James Walsh, no relation to Chaplain Walsh, who decided to conduct a quiet investigation into the hospital's practices. The bishop's inquiry would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Divine Healing Ward, though it would take more than a decade for the full truth to emerge. The bishop's investigation began in the autumn of 1865, conducted with the discretion that the Catholic Church had perfected over centuries of navigating sensitive situations. Bishop James Walsh was a careful man who understood that accusations against a respected medical institution required irrefutable evidence. He assigned Father Ali to document his observations more systematically while also reaching out to other clergy who had conducted funeral services for patients from the Divine Healing Ward. What they discovered was a pattern of physical evidence that contradicted the hospital's claims about spiritual healing. Too many bodies showed signs of needle marks, surgical incisions, and other medical interventions that seemed inconsistent with prayer-based treatment. Most disturbing were the cases where patients had apparently died from causes unrelated to their original illnesses. Deaths that suggested experimentation rather than natural progression of disease. Father O'Malley's private journal, later discovered in the church archives, contained detailed observations about the bodies he had prepared for burial. The Murphy woman, he wrote, referring to Bridge Murphy, no relation to Sister Murphy, who had died in 1864, showed evidence of multiple puncture wounds on her arms and torso. When I asked Sister Murphy about these marks, she explained that they were from spiritual therapy needles used to channel healing energy. But the pattern and depth of these wounds suggested something far more invasive than any spiritual practice I have witnessed. The investigation expanded in 1866 when Dr. Samuel Clark, a young physician who had recently completed his studies at Harvard Medical School, joined the staff at St. Thomas Hospital. Clark was assigned to work in the general medical wards, but his proximity to the Divine Healing Ward gave him opportunities to observe the operation that outsiders never had. Clark was immediately struck by the unusual protocols surrounding the ward. Medical supplies were ordered separately. Patient records were kept in a locked filing system, and the nursing staff who worked in the ward were forbidden from discussing their duties with other hospital personnel. Most suspicious was the fact that the ward's mortality rate was exactly 100%. Every patient who was admitted died despite the hospital's claims about miraculous healing. Clark's medical training had taught him to think scientifically about disease and treatment. He began keeping his own private records of observations about the Divine Healing Ward, noting patterns in patient admissions, duration of stays, and circumstances of death. His notes, written in a coded system he had developed during his medical studies, would later provide crucial evidence about the ward's operations. The breakthrough came in early 1867, when Clark managed to gain access to one of the observation rooms during a night shift. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were attending a medical conference in Philadelphia, and the hospital's regular security procedures were more relaxed than usual. Clark used his master key to enter the restricted area of the ward, ostensibly to check on a patient who had been moved there the previous day. What he found in the observation room shattered his understanding of what was happening in the Divine Healing Ward. The room contained not just a bed for patient care, but an extensive array of medical instruments, measuring devices, and what appeared to be experimental apparatus. There were vials of various substances, some labeled with chemical formulas that Clark didn't recognize, others marked only with numerical codes. The patient in the room was Thomas Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had been admitted with what appeared to be tuberculosis. But the man Clark found was barely conscious, showing signs of severe drug intoxication. His breathing was labored, his pulse was weak and irregular, and his skin showed evidence of multiple injections. A detailed chart at the foot of his bed documented hourly measurements of his vital signs along with notes about his responses to various treatments. Clark's medical training told him that Thomas Kowalski was dying not from tuberculosis, but from systematic poisoning. The substances being administered to him were not healing medications, but experimental compounds that were destroying his body's ability to function. The chart at the foot of his bed wasn't a medical record. It was a research log documenting the progress of a human experiment. The most chilling discovery was a notebook left open on a table beside the bed. Written in Anderson's handwriting, it contained detailed observations about Kowalski's responses to different doses of various substances. The entries were coldly clinical, treating the dying man as nothing more than a research subject. The final entry, dated the previous day, read, "Subject TK showing expected neurological depression. Recommend increasing dose of compound B23 to observe complete systemic breakdown." Clark realized that he was witnessing not healing but murder disguised as medicine. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't treating patients. It was using them as experimental subjects, documenting their responses to various substances and procedures until they died. The spiritual healing was an elaborate cover story designed to prevent scrutiny of what was actually systematic human experimentation. The young physician faced an impossible choice. He could report what he had discovered, but doing so would require him to admit that he had violated hospital security protocols and gained unauthorized access to restricted areas. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were respected members of the medical community, while Clark was a recent graduate with no established reputation. His accusations would likely be dismissed as the fantasies of an inexperienced physician seeking attention. Clark decided to continue his investigation, gathering more evidence before making any accusations. He began paying closer attention to the ward's operations, documenting patterns in patient admissions and deaths. He also started building relationships with other hospital staff members, hoping to find allies who might have observed suspicious activities. His efforts led to a connection with Margaret Flanagan, a young Irish woman who worked as a cleaning girl in the hospital. Margaret had been assigned to clean the Divine Healing ward during night shifts, and she had observed activities that troubled her deeply. She had seen patients being moved to the observation rooms when they appeared to be getting better, not worse. She had witnessed Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh conducting procedures that looked nothing like prayer or spiritual healing. Margaret's observations were limited by her education and her position in the hospital hierarchy, but her instincts told her that something terrible was happening in the Divine Healing ward. She had tried to raise concerns with her supervisor, but had been told that the spiritual healing process was beyond the understanding of uneducated workers and that her job was to clean, not to observe or question. The connection between Clark and Margaret proved crucial to understanding the full scope of the operation. Margaret's access to the ward during night shifts provided opportunities to observe activities that were hidden from other staff members. Clark's medical knowledge allowed him to interpret what Margaret was seeing and to understand the significance of the equipment and procedures she described. Together, they began to piece together a picture of systematic human experimentation that had been operating under the guise of spiritual healing for over a decade. The observation rooms were actually laboratories where terminal patients were used as test subjects for experimental medications and procedures. The detailed records kept by Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh weren't spiritual journals. They were scientific data documenting the effects of various substances on human subjects. The motivation behind the operation was beginning to become clear. Anderson's correspondence with European physicians wasn't just about sharing knowledge. It was about selling research data. The experimental results gathered from the Divine Healing ward were being compiled into reports that were sold to pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions in Europe and America. The patients who died in the ward weren't just victims of medical experimentation. They were unwitting contributors to a profitable business in human research data. The scale of the operation was staggering. By 1867, 34 patients had died in the Divine Healing ward, and the hidden records showed that each death had contributed to an expanding database of human research information. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh had developed standardized protocols for testing different types of substances and procedures, turning the ward into what amounted to a human laboratory. But the investigation that Clark and Margaret were conducting wasn't the only threat to the operation. The Catholic Church's inquiry, led by Bishop Walsh and Father O'Malley, was also gathering evidence about the ward's practices. The bishop had begun sharing his concerns with other religious leaders in Pittsburgh, and word was spreading through the city's clergy about suspicious activities at St. Thomas Hospital. The convergence of these investigations was about to bring the truth about the Divine Healing ward into the open, but the consequences would be far more complex and disturbing than anyone imagined. The systematic human experimentation that had been hidden behind spiritual healing was about to be revealed. But the full scope of the operation and its connections to the broader medical community would prove to be even more shocking than the original crimes. The winter of 1867 brought an unexpected crisis that would test the carefully constructed facade of the Divine Healing ward. Dr. William Harrison, a prominent physician from New York and a personal friend of Andrew Carnegie, arrived in Pittsburgh to visit his sister, who had been admitted to the ward with advanced consumption. Harrison was not the kind of family member that Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were accustomed to dealing with. He was educated, wealthy, and accustomed to demanding detailed explanations about medical treatment. Harrison's sister, Elizabeth, was a widow who had moved to Pittsburgh to live with her daughter's family. She'd been diagnosed with consumption by the family's regular physician, but the disease had progressed more rapidly than expected. When the family learned about the Divine Healing ward's reputation for providing comfort to terminal patients, they had arranged for her admission, believing that the combination of medical care and spiritual healing would provide the best possible outcome. Dr. Harrison arrived at the hospital on a cold February morning, expecting to find his sister receiving the innovative treatment that had made St. Thomas Hospital famous throughout the region. Instead, he was met with the same restrictions and explanations that had been used to manage other families. Elizabeth was in a critical phase of treatment that required absolute privacy and spiritual focus, and visits were limited to prevent disruption of the healing process. Harrison's medical training and professional status made him far more challenging to manage than the typical family member. He demanded detailed information about his sister's treatment, asked pointed questions about the ward's protocols, and insisted on speaking with the physicians responsible for her care. Anderson met with him personally, but the conversation went badly from the start. "Dr. Anderson, I appreciate your hospital's reputation for innovative treatment," Harrison began, his tone professional but firm. "However, I am concerned about the restrictions you placed on family visits. In my experience, family support is crucial for patient recovery, particularly in cases of advanced consumption." Anderson's response was polished but evasive. "Dr. Harrison, I understand your concern as both a physician and a family member. However, the Divine Healing Ward operates according to specialized protocols that have been developed over many years of experience. The combination of medical treatment and spiritual healing requires an environment of complete tranquility and focus." "I'm not questioning your methods," Harrison replied, "but I would like to understand them better. What specific treatments is my sister receiving? What medications are being administered? What is the expected timeline for her recovery?" The question struck at the heart of the deception that had protected the ward for over a decade. Anderson found himself unable to provide the detailed medical information that Harrison was requesting without revealing the true nature of the treatments being administered. His responses became increasingly vague and defensive, raising Harrison's suspicions about the ward's operations. The confrontation escalated when Harrison demanded to see his sister immediately, regardless of the hospital's protocols. Anderson refused, explaining that Elizabeth was in a critical phase of treatment that could not be interrupted. Harrison threatened to remove his sister from the hospital and transfer her to a facility in New York where she could receive conventional medical treatment. The crisis forced Anderson to make a dangerous decision. Rather than risk having Harrison remove his sister and potentially expose the ward's methods to outside scrutiny, he decided to allow a carefully managed visit. Elizabeth was moved from the observation room, where she had been undergoing experimental treatment, to a room in the main ward area where she could be presented to her brother as receiving conventional spiritual healing. But the damage had already been done. When Harrison finally saw his sister, his medical training immediately told him that something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth was in a state of severe drug intoxication, showing symptoms that had nothing to do with consumption. Her pupils were dilated, her speech was slurred, and her skin showed evidence of multiple injection sites that couldn't be explained by any conventional treatment for lung disease. Harrison's examination of his sister took place in the presence of Sister Murphy, who attempted to explain Elizabeth's condition as the result of intensive spiritual therapy combined with blessed medications that worked differently from conventional drugs. But Harrison's medical expertise allowed him to recognize the signs of systematic drug administration, and his growing alarm was evident to everyone in the room. "What exactly are these blessed medications you've been giving my sister?" Harrison demanded, his professional composure beginning to crack. "These symptoms suggest opiate intoxication, combined with what appears to be mercury poisoning. This is not the treatment of consumption. This is systematic drugging." Sister Murphy's response revealed the strain that years of deception had placed on the conspirators. Her usual calm demeanor faltered as she struggled to provide explanations that would satisfy a trained physician. "Dr. Charmatian, Harrison, the medications we use here are specially prepared according to protocols developed by Dr. Anderson in consultation with European specialists. The spiritual aspect of the healing process can sometimes produce effects that appear unusual to those unfamiliar with our methods." But Harrison was no longer listening to explanations. He was conducting a thorough medical examination of his sister, documenting evidence that would later prove crucial to exposing the ward's operations. Elizabeth's condition was consistent with someone who had been subjected to experimental drug administration over an extended period. The injection sites on her arms and torso followed patterns that suggested systematic testing of different substances at different dosages. Most damning was Elizabeth's mental state. During brief moments of clarity between drug-induced stupors, she spoke of treatments that bore no resemblance to spiritual healing. She described being taken to a special room where doctors administered injections that made her feel strange and disconnected. She spoke of being asked questions about how the medications made her feel, and of having her responses carefully written down in notebooks. Harrison realized that his sister had been the victim of human experimentation, disguised as medical treatment. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't providing spiritual healing. It was using terminal patients as test subjects for experimental drugs and procedures. The high mortality rate wasn't the result of divine will calling souls home. It was the inevitable outcome of systematic poisoning. The confrontation that followed would later be described by hospital staff as the most intense conflict in St. Thomas Hospital's history. Harrison demanded immediate access to his sister's medical records, threatened to involve the police, and vowed to expose the ward's practices to the medical community. Anderson, realizing that the operation was in immediate danger of exposure, made a decision that would prove to be his fatal mistake. Instead of allowing Harrison to remove his sister and potentially exposing the operation to outside scrutiny, Anderson decided to silence the threat permanently. Elizabeth Harrison died that night officially from respiratory failure due to advanced consumption, but the hidden records would later reveal that she had been given a massive dose of a substance that Anderson had been testing for its effects on the respiratory system. Harrison's grief was compounded by his certainty that his sister had been murdered. He demanded an autopsy, but Anderson's influence with the city's medical examiner ensured that the request was denied. The official cause of death stood, and Elizabeth was buried in Pittsburgh's Allegheny Cemetery with a funeral service that praised the hospital's compassionate attempt to provide comfort in her final hours. But Harrison didn't accept the official explanation. He began his own investigation into the Divine Healing Ward, using his connections in the medical community to gather information about the hospital's practices. His inquiries reached Dr. Charmhouse, Clark, who had been conducting his own secret investigation, and the two physicians began sharing their concerns about the ward's operations. The alliance between Harrison and Clark proved to be the beginning of the end for Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh. Harrison's medical expertise and professional connections provided credibility for Clark's observations, while Clark's position within the hospital gave him access to information that Harrison couldn't obtain as an outsider. Together, they began building a case that would eventually expose the full scope of the operation. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church's investigation was also intensifying. Bishop Walsh had shared his concerns with the Archbishop of Philadelphia, who had begun his own inquiry into the hospital's practices. The church's investigation was proceeding cautiously, but the evidence being gathered by Father Ali was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The convergence of these investigations created a dangerous situation for the Divine Healing Ward. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were facing scrutiny from multiple directions, and their usual methods of managing suspicious family members were no longer sufficient to protect their operation. The death of Elizabeth Harrison had eliminated one immediate threat, but it had also created new enemies who were determined to expose the truth. The strain of maintaining their deception was beginning to show in all three conspirators. Anderson had become increasingly paranoid. Convinced that hospital staff members were spying on the ward's activities, he installed additional locks on the observation rooms and restricted access even further, creating an atmosphere of secrecy that was attracting unwanted attention. Sister Murphy was showing signs of psychological breakdown. Her public persona remained composed, but those who worked closely with her noticed dramatic changes in her behavior. She had begun talking to herself during night shifts, and several staff members reported hearing her crying in the chapel during her prayer sessions. The weight of participating in dozens of murders was taking a toll that she was struggling to hide. Chaplain Walsh had responded to the pressure by becoming even more convinced of the righteousness of their mission. His private writings from this period revealed a man who had completely lost touch with moral reality. He had developed elaborate theological justifications for their actions, arguing that the patients who died in the Divine Healing Ward were martyrs whose suffering was serving God's plan to advance medical knowledge for the benefit of humanity. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in St. Thomas Hospital's Divine Healing Ward intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most shocking revelations are still to come. The breaking point came in the spring of 1868, when Dr. Clark made a discovery that would finally provide the evidence needed to expose the operation. During one of his nighttime observations of the ward, he discovered the entrance to Anderson's basement laboratory, a facility that contained not just experimental equipment, but also detailed records of every patient who had died in the Divine Healing Ward. The laboratory was a sophisticated operation that rivaled anything found in major medical institutions. Anderson had invested substantial resources in acquiring advanced equipment, much of it imported from European suppliers. There were devices for measuring physiological responses, apparatus for synthesizing chemical compounds, and an extensive library of medical texts and journals that dealt with experimental pharmacology. But the most damning evidence was found in Anderson's research files. Detailed records of every experiment conducted in the Divine Healing Ward were meticulously documented, including precise descriptions of the substances administered, the physiological responses observed, and the exact cause of death in each case. The files revealed that the operation had been far more systematic and extensive than anyone had imagined. The record showed that Anderson had been in correspondence with pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions throughout Europe and America, selling detailed reports on human responses to experimental drugs. The patients who died in the Divine Healing Ward had unwittingly contributed to a database of human research information that was being used to develop new medications and treatments. Their deaths had been profitable as well as scientifically valuable. Most shocking was the discovery that the operation extended beyond St. Thomas Hospital. Anderson's correspondence revealed that he had been providing protocols and guidance to physicians in other cities who were interested in establishing similar programs. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't an isolated case of medical experimentation. It was part of a network of institutions that were using terminal patients as research subjects under the guise of spiritual healing. The final confrontation began on the night of October 15, 1868, when Dr. Clark made a discovery that would bring 23 years of systematic murder to light. While conducting his usual surveillance of the Divine Healing Ward, he witnessed Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh moving what appeared to be a large wooden crate from the basement laboratory to a waiting carriage outside the hospital's rear entrance. The crate was heavy enough to require all three of them to carry it, and they handled it with the careful precision of people moving something extremely valuable. Clark followed the carriage through Pittsburgh's darkened streets, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping the vehicle in sight. The carriage traveled through the city's industrial district, past the steel mills and factories that belched smoke into the night sky, finally stopping at a warehouse near the Ohio River. What Clark witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the warehouse, Anderson's operation revealed its true scope. The building contained not just storage space, but a sophisticated laboratory that dwarfed the facility beneath the hospital. There were dozens of specimen jars containing what appeared to be human organs, extensive chemical apparatus, and filing cabinets filled with research documents. Most horrifying were the bodies, dozens of them, preserved in various states for what was clearly ongoing anatomical study. Clark realized that the patients who died in the Divine Healing Ward hadn't simply been murdered for experimental purposes. Their bodies had been systematically harvested for organs and tissue samples that were being sold to medical institutions throughout the country. The operation wasn't just about testing experimental drugs. It was a comprehensive human research program that treated patients as raw material for scientific study. The confrontation began when Clark attempted to leave the warehouse and accidentally knocked over a chemical apparatus. The sound alerted Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh to his presence, and they found him attempting to escape through a rear door. The three conspirators realized that their operation had been discovered by someone who understood exactly what he was seeing, Dr. Clark Anderson said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had convinced hundreds of families to entrust their loved ones to his care. "I'm surprised to find you here. This is a private research facility not open to unauthorized visitors." Clark's response revealed the full extent of his investigation. "I know what you've been doing, Anderson. I've seen the laboratory beneath the hospital. I've read the research files, and I know about the patients you've murdered. This operation ends tonight." The conversation that followed was recorded in Clark's private journal written immediately after the events at the warehouse. Anderson made no attempt to deny the accusations, instead launching into a passionate defense of their work that revealed the twisted logic that had justified 23 years of systematic murder. "You don't understand the significance of what we've accomplished here," Anderson argued. "The knowledge we've gained from our research has advanced medical science by decades. The medications and treatments being developed from our data will save thousands of lives. These patients were dying anyway. We simply ensured that their deaths served a greater purpose." Sister Murphy's response was even more chilling. "Those people came to us seeking spiritual healing, and they found it. We provided them with the ultimate healing, release from earthly suffering, and the privilege of contributing to God's plan for advancing human knowledge. Their sacrifice was beautiful in its way." Chaplain Walsh offered the most disturbing justification of all. "The divine plan works through human instruments. Dr. Clark, we were chosen to conduct this sacred work to gather the knowledge that God intends for humanity to possess. Every patient who died in our care was a willing participant in a holy mission that transcends earthly understanding." Clark realized that he was dealing with three people who had completely lost touch with moral reality. Years of justifying murder as medical research and spiritual service had created a psychological framework that allowed them to view their victims as willing participants in a noble cause. They genuinely believed that they were serving both science and God through their systematic killing. The confrontation escalated when Clark attempted to leave the warehouse to report his discoveries to the authorities. Anderson, realizing that exposure was inevitable, made the decision that would finally bring their operation to light. Instead of attempting to silence Clark, he chose to destroy the evidence that could be used against them. Anderson began systematically destroying the research files, pouring chemical accelerants over the documents and specimens that represented decades of work. The fire that resulted would not only destroy the evidence, but would also alert the Pittsburgh Fire Department and police to the existence of the warehouse and its contents. But Anderson had made a fatal miscalculation. In his haste to destroy the evidence, he had forgotten about the research files hidden beneath the chapel floor at St. Thomas Hospital. Those documents, along with the laboratory equipment in the hospital's basement, would provide all the evidence needed to expose the full scope of their operation. The warehouse fire brought investigators to the scene within hours. What they found in the partially destroyed facility was enough to launch a comprehensive investigation into St. Thomas Hospital and the Divine Healing Ward. The preserved bodies, the research equipment, and the partially burned documents told a story of systematic human experimentation that shocked even experienced investigators. Dr. Harrison, who had been contacted by Clark earlier that evening, arrived at the warehouse as the investigation was beginning. The evidence he found there confirmed his worst suspicions about his sister's death and provided the proof he needed to expose the operation to the medical community and the press. The investigation that followed would reveal the true scope of the Divine Healing Ward's operations. 67 patients had died over 23 years, each one the victim of systematic experimentation that had been hidden behind the facade of spiritual healing. The research data gathered from these murders had been sold to pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions throughout the world, generating substantial profits for Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The investigation would uncover evidence that the operation extended far beyond St. Thomas Hospital, involving a network of physicians and institutions that had been conducting similar experiments under various covers throughout the United States and Europe. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't an isolated case of medical evil. It was part of a systematic program of human experimentation that had been operating for decades. The dawn of October 16, 1868 brought an end to one of the most horrific medical deceptions in American history. But it also revealed the true scope of the evil that had been hidden behind the Divine Healing Ward's facade of spiritual healing. As Pittsburgh police and federal investigators combed through the evidence found at the warehouse and the hospital, the full magnitude of Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh's crimes became clear. The hidden research files discovered beneath the chapel floor contained meticulous documentation of every patient who had died in the Divine Healing Ward. Each file included detailed medical histories, experimental protocols, physiological observations, and postmortem findings. The records revealed that the 67 deaths weren't random murders, but part of a systematic research program designed to test the limits of human endurance and gather data on experimental medications and procedures. Most damning were the financial records that showed the operation's true motivation. Anderson had been selling research reports to pharmaceutical companies in Germany, France, and England, earning substantial sums for detailed documentation of human responses to experimental drugs. The patients who died in the Divine Healing Ward had unknowingly contributed to the development of medications that would be used throughout the world. Their suffering transformed into profit for their killers. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated network that had supported the operation. Anderson had been corresponding with physicians in Baltimore, Richmond, New York, and even London, sharing protocols and providing guidance for establishing similar programs. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't an isolated case of medical experimentation. It was the flagship operation of a larger network that had been conducting human research under various covers throughout the medical world. Sister Murphy was found dead in her quarters at the hospital on the morning of October 17th. Apparently having taken her own life with the same substances that had been used to kill patients in the Divine Healing Ward. Her suicide note, written in her careful handwriting, revealed the psychological toll that years of participating in systematic murder had taken on her conscience. "I can no longer bear the weight of what we have done," she wrote. "I believe that we were serving God's plan, that the knowledge we gathered would serve humanity's greater good. But I see now that we were serving only our own pride and greed. The faces of those who died trusting in our care haunt me day and night. May God forgive me for the evil I have done in His name." Chaplain Walsh was arrested at his home in Pittsburgh's Presbyterian district, where investigators found extensive theological writings that revealed how he had justified the murders as divine service. His personal library contained detailed studies of religious martyrdom and sacrifice, along with elaborate theological arguments that attempted to prove that their victims had been willing participants in God's plan for advancing human knowledge. During his interrogation, Walsh showed no remorse for the murders, instead maintaining that he and his co-conspirators had been divinely chosen to conduct a research. "We were instruments of divine will," he insisted to investigators. "The knowledge we gathered will benefit humanity for generations to come. Those who died in our care achieved a form of immortality through their contribution to medical science." Dr. Anderson vanished on the night of the warehouse fire and was never seen again. Some investigators believed that he had died in the blaze, but others suspected that he had escaped and was continuing his work elsewhere. His correspondence with European physicians suggested that he had prepared escape routes and alternative identities that would allow him to continue his research in other locations. The search for Anderson led investigators to discover the full extent of the network he had created. Physicians in 6 different cities were found to be conducting similar experiments under various covers, from spiritual healing programs to experimental charity clinics. The investigation expanded to involve federal authorities and international law enforcement agencies, revealing that the systematic exploitation of terminal patients for medical research was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. The families of the 67 victims faced the devastating realization that their loved ones had not died peacefully during spiritual healing, but had been systematically murdered as part of a profitable research program. Patrick O'Brien, whose wife Margaret had been the first victim in 1856, led a group of families in demanding justice and compensation for their losses. "They told us our loved ones were in God's hands," O'Brien said at a public meeting held at St. Patrick's Church, "but they were actually in the hands of devils who used their suffering to make money. We trusted them with our most precious treasures, and they turned that trust into profit and pain." The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Chaplain Walsh was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he died in his cell just 2 years later, apparently from natural causes. The physicians who had been part of Anderson's network faced various charges, with some fleeing the country before they could be arrested. The pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions that had purchased research data from Anderson's operation faced civil lawsuits and public condemnation, though many argued that they had been unaware how the data was obtained. The legal battles continued for years, with some families eventually receiving financial settlements, though no amount of money could compensate for the horror their loved ones had endured. Thomas Hospital was closed permanently in December 1868, its reputation destroyed by the revelations about the Divine Healing Ward. The building was eventually sold to the city of Pittsburgh and converted into offices for municipal services, though many residents believed that the structure should be demolished entirely. The chapel, where the research files had been hidden, was sealed, and the basement laboratory was filled with concrete to prevent anyone from accessing the site where so much evil had been conducted. The broader impact of the Divine Healing Ward scandal extended far beyond Pittsburgh. Medical societies throughout the United States implemented new oversight procedures for experimental treatments, and several states passed laws requiring detailed documentation and approval for any research involving human subjects. The scandal also led to increased scrutiny of spiritual healing programs and other alternative medical treatments that claimed to combine faith and science. The Catholic Church's investigation, led by Bishop Walsh and Father Ali, resulted in new guidelines for clergy involvement in medical treatment. The Church issued a formal statement condemning the use of religious faith as a cover for medical experimentation and established procedures for investigating suspicious deaths that occurred during spiritual healing. Dr. Clark, whose investigation had been crucial to exposing the operation, left Pittsburgh and established a practice in Boston, where he became a leading advocate for medical ethics and patient rights. His writings about the Divine Healing Ward scandal were published in medical journals throughout the world and helped establish the ethical frameworks that guide medical research today. Margaret Flanagan, the cleaning girl whose observations had helped Clark gather evidence, was offered a position as a nurse at Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital, where she completed her training and became a respected advocate for patient safety. Her testimony about the activities she had witnessed in the Divine Healing Ward was crucial to the prosecution's case against Chaplain Walsh. This mystery shows us the horrifying potential for evil that exists when trust is betrayed and suffering is exploited for profit. The Divine Healing Ward scandal revealed how easily respected institutions can hide systematic cruelty behind facades of compassion and service. It reminds us that vigilance and skepticism are necessary safeguards against those who would exploit the vulnerable for their own gain. The families who lost loved ones in the Divine Healing Ward never fully recovered from the betrayal of trust they experienced. They had entrusted their most precious treasures to people they believed were dedicated to healing and spiritual service, only to discover that their loved ones had been systematically murdered for profit. The psychological trauma of this revelation was in many ways worse than the original grief of losing a family member to terminal illness. Yet the scandal also demonstrated the power of persistence and courage in exposing evil. Dr. Clark's willingness to risk his career to investigate suspicious activities, Father Ali's determination to document evidence despite institutional pressure, and Dr. Harrison's refusal to accept official explanations all contributed to bringing the truth to light. Their efforts ensured that the 67 victims of the Divine Healing Ward did not die in vain, as their deaths ultimately led to reforms that protected countless other patients from similar exploitation. The empty building that once housed St. Thomas Hospital still stands on its hill overlooking the Allegheny River, though it has been renovated extensively and now serves as Pittsburgh's municipal archives. Visitors to the building often report feeling an inexplicable sense of unease in the areas that once housed the Divine Healing Ward, though the third floor has been completely rebuilt and bears no resemblance to its original configuration. The cemetery where many of the ward's victims were buried has become a place of pilgrimage for those interested in the history of medical ethics and patient rights. A memorial erected in 1895 bears the names of all 67 victims and includes the inscription in memory of those who suffered in trust and in commitment to ensuring that such betrayal never occurs again. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there be more secrets still hidden? The evidence suggests that Dr. Anderson's network extended far beyond what investigators were able to uncover, and some historians believe that similar operations may have continued in other locations for years after the Pittsburgh scandal was exposed. Leave your comment below with your thoughts about this chilling tale. If you enjoyed this dark mystery and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten secret from America's past.